What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today we are talking about breakout defensemen. And listen, I talked about breakout defensemen in a video that I posted back in April, but things have changed. My opinions have changed and I've done more research on these players. So I wanted to share with you guys my updated takes. Not only am I going to be sharing with you guys my updated takes on the players that I already discussed in April, but there's also some new players that I didn't talk about that I think have a lot of upside. One disclaimer that I do have to mention for this video is that these defensemen are breakout candidates. There is no guarantee that these defensemen break out. In fact, these defensemen are high risk, high reward players. For most of these defensemen, if they don't get on the first unit, they are likely to be duds in fantasy hockey. Nonetheless, if these players do make it onto the first power play unit, they are going to have a lot of upside, and that means they would be great values in your upcoming drafts. Speaking of value, guys, make sure you download Drafters Fantasy Sports on iOS or Android. You can use my promo code FIREDUP, and that will give you a 100% match deposit up to $100. Drafters is available in all of Canada, including Ontario and most US states. You can do pick'ems on there. You can do best ball drafts. Right now, there's a couple of days left in the NFL Best Ball Championship. There's a huge overlay as well, so there's definitely a lot of value in doing that. Drafters is also available on desktop, guys, but make sure you use promo code FIREDUP and not the default promo code they have in there, because the default one is only a 50% match deposit versus mine, which is 100%. 20 gets you 40, 40 gets you 80, 100 gets you 200, and you can potentially win thousands of dollars in the upcoming best ball drafts in the NHL. Make sure you gamble responsibly, but if you want to learn more, there's more information in the comments. One last thing I want to say before we start this video is make sure you hit that subscribe button below. 68.1% of you guys are not subscribed who watch my videos. I mean, come on, guys. It's simple to do, it's free, and it really helps support the channel. I'm just going to give you guys 2 seconds to do that right now. Wow, thank you. That was great. Also, you can hit the like button while you're at it, okay? Let's roll the video. The first breakout candidate I want to talk about is Scott Perunovich of the St. Louis Blues. As you guys know, Torrey Krug was diagnosed with pre-arthritic changes in his ankle, which means that he may miss the entire season. With that being said, Krug has been the quarterback on the first power play unit for the Blues, so if he misses the entire season, there is a spot to fill. Last season on the Blues, Perunovich had the most power play time per game, only behind Krug, so there is a good chance that he ends up on this first unit. There's also a case for Falk, who was third in power play time per game. It was very similar to Perunovich's numbers, but I do think because Perunovich got more time that I would slightly lean Perunovich. I do want to give you guys a big warning about Perunovich though. If he's not on the first unit, he is going to be an absolute dud in fantasy. He's a third pairing defenseman. He doesn't put up a lot of hits or blocks if your league values those, and he is a guy that doesn't necessarily have a guaranteed roster spot for this upcoming year. In my opinion, the Blues do not trust Perunovich long term, and what has further solidified this opinion is the Blues offer sheeting Phillip Broberg and giving him the money that they gave him. One major concern I do have with Perunovich that I want to highlight here is that in the 73 games that he's played with the Blues in his career, he has scored 0 goals. In these 73 games, he has only put up 50 shots. That is terrible. He looks like he is scared to shoot out there, and that is a major problem on the power play because that becomes very predictable. So yeah, he is a breakout candidate, but don't be drafting him unless you are in a super deep league. The next defenseman breakout candidate I want to talk about is Kevin Korchinski of the Chicago Blackhawks. Korchinski was drafted 7th overall in the 2022 NHL entry draft, and last season as a rookie, he put up 15 points in 76 games. Ultimately, with Korchinski, the only way that he's going to break out is if the Blackhawks decide to put him on the first unit over Seth Jones. I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, I'm going to be drafting Seth Jones quite a bit this season, but I do want to mention that last season, there were games where Korchinski was on the first unit over Jones, and he actually got a decent amount of power play time last year with 1 minute and 47 seconds of power play time per game. If Jones struggles on this power play, I don't think they're going to hesitate to put Korchinski on this first unit. So yeah, with that being a possibility, he is a breakout candidate, but you do have a major roadblock there with Seth Jones. I think in the future, Korchinski is going to be a beast in fantasy hockey. I think he's eventually going to be quarterbacking that first line power play with Bedard, but I'm just not sure it's going to happen this year. With that being said, I wouldn't be drafting Korchinski in fantasy hockey unless I was in like a 24 team league. He is a guy that you might want to take a look at on the waiver wire if Jones starts to struggle on this power play and they put Korchinski on. Next up, we got to talk about Boston Bruins defenseman Mason Lohrei. Like I said with the players that I just talked about, and what I'm probably going to say for every single player on this list, Lohrei will not break out unless he's on the first line power play. They signed Nikita Zadorov in the offseason. They already have Hampus Lindholm on the left side as well. So ultimately, yes, he's going to be a third pairing defenseman, and his breakout potential is solely relied on him getting on that first line power play. If you watch my power play video, I did talk about him a little bit there. I did say there is a possibility that he can be on this first unit. I do think it's going to be Charlie McAvoy, especially to start the year, but there is a case for Lohrei, and let me break it down. Listen, the only reason I think Lohrei has a small chance of getting on this first unit is because in my opinion, McAvoy didn't look very good on the power play last year. This is just my opinion, guys, but the numbers show it too. He only had 14 power play points, and we've seen in the past him get taken off the first line power play in favor of players like Hampus Lindholm. So yeah, his role on the first line power play is not exactly secure. I think Matt Grzelcyk is also a guy that was on the first line power play over McAvoy a couple of years ago as well. McAvoy is not necessarily this offensive beast, guys. Lohrei looked really good in the playoffs last year. He had 4 points in 11 games. He put up 13 points in 41 games during the regular season, despite very limited ice time. And in the AHL, he had 16 points in 21 games. So this guy can produce, and I think there's a chance if McAvoy starts struggling middle of the season, later on in the season, they could give Lohrei a couple of looks. But that being said, there is clear upside here, but don't be drafting Mason Lohrei unless you're in a very deep league. I'm not going to be drafting him. I won't be drafting him in best ball either, but he is a breakout candidate, and I'm interested to see if he can get on that first unit. Next up, let's talk about Phillip Broberg of the St. Louis Blues. He signed with the Blues as an RFA, and the Oilers ultimately decided not to match the offer sheet. So yeah, he's on the St. Louis Blues, and I think there's a potential for him to be a top 4 defenseman and potentially get some good power play time. Broberg only played 12 regular season games with the Oilers last year, putting up 2 points, but in the playoffs, he actually had some good production, and I thought he looked really solid. Broberg also had a really good AHL season where he put up 38 points in 49 games, a season where he got some good power play time as well with Bakersfield. So yeah, I liked what I saw in the AHL and in the playoffs as well, and that's why I do think there is a potential that Broberg could actually not be a bust. Like I said earlier, Krug was diagnosed with pre-arthritic changes in his ankle, meaning that there is a chance he misses the entire season, and Krug was the guy that was quarterbacking the first unit last season. So if he's not playing, there's an open spot. The main options that we have here are Scott Perunovich. He got the second most power play time per game among the defensemen on the Blues last season, so he's definitely going to be an option to run this first unit. You also have Justin Falk, who got the third most power play time per game last season, very close to Perunovich's time, and we've seen Falk quarterback that first unit in the past as well, so he'll definitely get a look too. Another distant option is Nick Leddy, who hasn't got a lot of power play time on the Blues, but he used to get good power play time on the Isles, so maybe they'll give him a look. Then there's also a very, very distant option in Colton Parayko, who got some looks on the first unit last year, but he's a guy that they play on the penalty kill in a lot of different situations, tough matchups, and it just doesn't really make sense for him to run this first unit. Now, in terms of the case for Phillip Broberg to get on the first line power play, I think that if Krug does miss the entire season, Broberg has a solid chance. The reason I think this is because we do have a lot of negatives with these defensemen. One, Scott Perunovich. Even though Perunovich is a solid offensive defenseman, even though he's shown some promise, we have to look at his numbers in the NHL. He has played 73 games with the St. Louis Blues, and he has not scored a single goal. In these 70 games, Perunovich has only put up 50 shots. That is terrible. Perunovich looks like he's scared to shoot the puck out there, and I don't know if that's going to change for this upcoming season. Now, that's a case against Perunovich, but we also have to talk about Falk's negatives. I would love Falk to be on the first line power play because he puts up amazing shot sets and blocks, and he would just be a huge sleeper in fantasy. But if we look at the history of the Blues, they have not trusted Falk to quarterback this first unit. Whatever it is, they have preferred other defensemen on this first unit, and I think that's pretty telling. I think it's telling that Perunovich got more power play time per game than Falk last season. In conclusion, if Krug is out and considering the negatives of those other defensemen, I think Broberg has a realistic shot on the first line power play, and if he does, there is definitely upside. I will say though that unless we get some confirmation that Broberg is going to be on the first unit, I'm not going to be drafting him unless I was in a super deep league. That's just not going to happen, guys. He won't have a lot of value without first line power play deployment, but there is upside, and I'm interested to see what he can do on the Blues this season. Next up, we have to talk about Montreal Canadiens defenseman Lane Hutson. This guy was elite in college last year and also the year prior. He had 49 points in 38 games with Boston University last season, and if we look at his college production, he averaged more points per game than Adam Fox in college, than Luke Hughes in college, and Quinn Hughes in college, and also Cale Makar in college. So yeah, he put up historic college numbers that we really haven't seen from a defenseman in the last 20 years. With that being said, he played 2 games with the Canadiens last year at the end of the season, and he put up 2 points in 2 games. So yeah, pretty good production to start his NHL career. Very small sample size, but I liked what I saw. Now, like I said at the start of this video, I made a breakout video back in April, and my opinions have definitely changed since I made that video, okay? Lane Hutson, he was in that video, and watching that back, I would say I was a little bit too positive about his fantasy potential this season. So yeah, let me give you guys my updated take and let's break it down. My updated take is that ultimately I do not expect them to take Matheson off this first unit. It could happen maybe middle of the year or end of the season, but I think to start the year, Matheson's going to be on the first unit, and without first line power play time, Lane Hutson is not going to be fantasy relevant in most leagues. Unfortunately, if he's not on the first unit, he's probably not putting up more than 30 or 35 points. In most leagues, that's not very relevant, especially because Hutson is not going to put up a lot of shots, hits, or blocks, so he's not going to have that safe floor baked in. Hutson's going to be a late round flyer and a very high risk, high reward player that some people may reach on and ultimately get burned because he won't end up on the first unit. Listen, Hutson is still a breakout candidate. He still has a lot of upside if he ends up on this first unit, but I think it's going to take a Mike Matheson injury or a Mike Matheson trade for that to happen. Matheson is very injury prone, so yes, if he goes down this season, Hutson will get on the first unit, and he's probably going to put up solid fantasy points if that's the case. The problem is that this is not fantasy football. I'm not going to be drafting a player in hopes that another player gets injured. It often doesn't happen, and I don't want to risk that and lose out in the draft. Now, I do want to talk about a possible Matheson trade. I could see Matheson getting traded at the trade deadline, depending on where the Canadiens are in the standings. And the reason for that is because the Canadiens are absolutely stacked when it comes to young, talented defensemen, and eventually Matheson is not going to have a role on this team. With that being said, though, they probably want to keep Matheson on the first unit to make sure he has value in a trade. So yes, there's a bunch of stuff to consider here and a bunch of roadblocks for Hutson to get on the first unit. The only alternative scenario where Matheson gets taken off the first unit in favor of Hutson is if the power play starts struggling and they want to mix things up, or Matheson as a player starts struggling and they feel Hutson would be a better fit. I'm not saying that it's impossible for this to happen, but we do have to recognize that Hutson is a rookie, and in fantasy hockey, rookies are usually not that good. With that being said, temper your expectations. Maybe take a late round flyer on Hutson because there is a possibility that maybe he does get on the first unit, or there's a Matheson injury, which would significantly increase Hutson's value. So yeah, you could take a late round flyer on him, but I wouldn't be drafting him unless you're in a deeper league. In conclusion, Hutson's very talented, very excited about his future, very excited about the Canadiens' future, but we have to see him get on the first unit in order for him to break out in fantasy. The next breakout candidate we are going to talk about here is Brandt Clarke of the Los Angeles Kings. Last season in the AHL, he put up 46 points in 50 games, and with this production, he led all AHL defensemen in points per game. Clarke played 16 games with the Kings last year, putting up 6 points, one of these points being a game-winning goal. And I would say that this production was very solid because he only averaged 13 minutes and 39 seconds of ice time per game, with only a minute and 30 being on the man advantage. Ultimately, the problem with Clarke is that Drew Doughty is currently quarterbacking the first line power play, and that power play was 11th best in the NHL last season. Doughty put up 20 power play points last year, and he was pretty good on there, so there's no reason for them to take him off. The only reason I can think of is that he plays a lot of minutes, and they could reduce his minutes to keep him fresh for other scenarios. So yes, there is that. We also do have to address that Doughty's about to be 35 years old, and we know that father time spares no one. So yes, these are factors to consider, but ultimately, with the Kings power play being successful last season, and with Doughty quarterbacking that power play for so long, I don't know if Clarke is going to get on this first unit. Ultimately, I think it's going to take a Doughty injury or the Kings power play struggling for them to put Clarke on this first unit. So yes, there is upside, but I do think that there is a roadblock in Doughty, and I wouldn't be reaching too hard for Clarke in your upcoming drafts. With those negatives aside, there's still a lot of positives. The obvious positive and upside is him getting on that first unit, but even if he's not on the first unit, there's still a lot of things that we can look forward to. The first positive is that I expect him to be with the team for the entire season. So yeah, 82 games of Clarke, that's great. The second positive is that his ice time is likely going to go up as well. So you're not going to see 13 minutes and 30 seconds of ice time per game. I think you're likely going to see at least 17 to 18 minutes. Even with that low ice time last year, he still put up 6 points in 16 games, which is a 30-point pace. It's a small sample size, but still, like, even if he's not quarterbacking this first unit, there's a chance he puts up 30 to 40 points this year. Another positive is that even if he's not quarterbacking the first unit, he's going to be quarterbacking the second unit, so he'll still have some power play point potential. And then the last positive is that Brandt Clarke likes to shoot the puck a ton. I mean, last season, he was second in shots per 60 among all NHL defensemen. This was only behind Dougie Hamilton, and I know that both Hamilton and Clarke had small sample sizes, and that's a reason they were so high up on this list. But still, like, Clarke likes to shoot the puck, and a lot of leagues heavily value shots. He's not a guy that's going to put up great hits or blocks, but still, having that high shot volume is very important in most leagues. So at least with Clarke, you're going to have that over a guy like Hutson. One more thing I wanted to highlight with Clarke's shot volume is that even if we don't look at shots per 60 and we just look at shots per game, he was still 37th in the NHL among defensemen. He averaged 1.94 shots per game, with 13 minutes and 39 seconds of ice time per game, which was more than Adam Fox, who averaged 23 minutes of ice time per game. The last thing I want to touch on is the defenseman depth chart on the Kings. I do have some concerns that Clarke's not going to be a second pairing defenseman. I think he might end up being on the third pairing because they do have Jordan Spence on the right side. So I don't love that. And obviously, if he's not on the first unit, he's going to be a third pairing second unit guy, which isn't going to be that great. But regardless, like I said, I still think that he's going to see a bump in ice time. He has the potential to get on the first unit, and he's going to put up a lot of shots. So yeah, I still like him for this year as a late round flyer and a guy that you look at on your waiver wire. But like I said with Hutson, temper your expectations and just see what happens. Next up, we have defenseman Olen Zellweger of the Anaheim Ducks. He only played 25 games with the Ducks last season, putting up 9 points, which isn't anything to write home about, but he definitely put up really good numbers in the AHL with 37 points in 44 games. Zellweger was second in points per game among AHL defensemen, and because of that, I think he's ready for the NHL and he's ready to be with the Ducks full time. Now, I do want to say that I like Zellweger. I think he has the potential to break out, but there are some red flags that we need to discuss because they do have an impact on fantasy hockey. The big red flag for me is his lack of peripherals, those peripherals being shots, hits, and blocks. If you're in a category league, Zellweger is going to be at a massive disadvantage, and if you're in a points league as well that heavily values peripherals, he's at a disadvantage too. The second red flag that I have about Zellweger is his size. He's 5'8" or 5'9". I'm not sure of his official height, but there is a concern of him potentially being a liability in the defensive end, and that could limit his minutes. The last red flag that I have is the Ducks typically run similar usages for both of their power play units, and that caps the ceilings for everyone involved. So even if Zellweger gets the most minutes on the power play out of the defenseman, it's still not going to be elite like you would see on other teams like the Florida Panthers or the Tampa Bay Lightning, etc. You are not going to see this type of usage, in my opinion, with the Ducks this season, and for that reason, Zellweger's ceiling is going to be capped. With those negatives aside, I think Zellweger is a fantastic offensive defenseman. I think he has a lot of potential, and I think out of Cam Fowler, Pavel Mintyukov, and Zellweger is going to get the most power play time this season. I talked about this with Mintyukov in other videos, but the assistant coach, Noel Brown, is no longer with the Ducks, and he was in charge of special teams last season, so there is a chance for this upcoming year that they decide to run a dedicated first unit. I don't think they're going to with their roster construction, but if they do, Zellweger definitely has the most to benefit from this, and that would definitely improve his upside. Regardless if the Ducks decide to run a dedicated first unit or not, I'm still expecting Zellweger to see a bump in even strength and power play time, and I do think that there's a possibility he could put up 30 to 40 points for this upcoming year. That could definitely be fantasy relevant in certain leagues. I am worried about the lack of shot sets and blocks, but yes, he has the potential to break out. He's very talented as an offensive defenseman, and we're just going to have to see what happens. The next breakout candidate here is Philadelphia Flyers defenseman Jamie Drysdale. Drysdale was traded to the Flyers in exchange for Cutter Gauthier last season, and he only played 24 games with the team due to injury. In those 24 games, he struggled, only putting up 5 points. Wasn't the best showing for Drysdale, but I do think there's still a lot of potential, so let's break it down. Drysdale was drafted 6th overall in the 2020 NHL entry draft. He put up really good numbers in the juniors, and in his sophomore season with the Ducks, he put up 32 points in 81 games. This was Drysdale's best season and his only full season, unfortunately. He had 12 power play points that year as well, and he only averaged 19 minutes and 53 seconds of ice time per game, so really solid production. Like I mentioned though, unfortunately, that was his only healthy season, and he has not been able to stay healthy in his NHL career. He is made of glass, guys. There's no other way to put it, and that is a major concern, not only for Flyers fans, but also people in fantasy hockey that might be considering drafting him. If we look at his career stats, his rookie year, he only played 24 games. Yes, that was a shortened season, but still didn't play the full year. The next season, yes, he played a full season, and that was great. But then, since then, in 22-23, he only played 8 games, and then last year, he only played 34 games. It is very tough to justify drafting Jamie Drysdale in fantasy hockey, knowing his injury history. I feel like I'm being very negative when I'm talking about these players, guys, but I do have to address the pros and cons with all of them, because most of them are not going to be fantasy relevant unless you're in a deeper league. I do have to warn you, so you don't see this video and you go out and draft them higher than you should, okay? I have to address the negatives, and I do have to talk about another negative as well. The Flyers have had the worst power play in the NHL in the last 3 years. In 21-22, they had the worst power play. In 22-23, they had the worst power play. And in 23-24, they had the worst power play. That is bad for fantasy. That is very bad, especially for defensemen that rely on first line power play deployment and power play points to be fantasy relevant. Another thing that concerns me is that the Flyers distribute the usage evenly for both power play units, so you're not going to see huge power play minutes for a player like Drysdale, and that caps the ceiling as well. Now, that all sounds very negative. I get it. But listen, there are some positives here, and there is a reason why he's a breakout candidate. The main positive is that out of all the defensemen last season for the Flyers, Drysdale had the most power play time per game. This is a sign to me that he's likely going to have the most power play time per game going into this season, and obviously that's good. With that being said, I also wanted to mention that this power play could improve from last season. There is a chance that maybe they don't have the worst power play in the NHL, and the main reason for that is you have Michkov coming in who could really elevate this power play and could really produce. You also have a lot of young talented players on the Flyers that could break out, players like Frost or Tippett or Forster, and if they do break out, then that's ultimately going to help the offense, and that's ultimately going to help the power play, which ultimately helps Jamie Drysdale. In conclusion, guys, if Drysdale manages to stay healthy for the entire season, you could see some solid production and maybe 40 to 45 points. I think 50 points would be his max ceiling in this offense and on this power play, but yes, we know he's going to lead in power play time per game among defensemen. We know the Flyers could improve this power play with some of their young talent breaking out, and we know Drysdale is really talented offensively. So yeah, there's upside here, and he's definitely a guy that could be drafted in a lot of leagues. The next defenseman I want to talk about is Jake Walman, who is now a San Jose Shark. I talked about Walman in my riser video a little bit, if you watched that. And what I said in that video is that with Walman going to the Sharks, he has gained a ton of value. There's no other way to put it. The Sharks don't have a lot of defensemen that are considered high quality defensemen. And with that being said, Walman does not have a lot of competition, not only for even strength minutes, but for power play time as well. Last season on the Red Wings, Walman was stuck behind Shane Gostisbehere and Moritz Seider on the power play, and that led to only 40 seconds of power play time per game. He didn't have a lot of opportunity on the Red Wings, but he's going to have way more opportunity on the Sharks team. Walman's not only going to see a bump in power play time, but he's also going to see a bump in even strength ice time as well. So yeah, I think this is great for his value, and he's also a player that puts up very good shots and blocks. He put up 151 blocks in 63 games last year. If you watch my power play video, I talked about the power play a little bit. There is a chance that Henry Thrun could get some looks on the first unit over Walman, but I think Walman's going to have a great shot to be on the first unit, and obviously that's very good for fantasy. Now, I do want to say one thing though about the Sharks power play, and that is that they might run distributed usage for both units. So that means that Walman's ceiling would be a little bit capped here, but regardless, this is a guy that's going to go super late in drafts, and he's a guy that only had his value increase this offseason. So yeah, it's all positives around, really. I like Walman a lot. The only negative I would say is he's due for some regression in the goal scoring department. He had 11.1 shooting percentage last year. He had 12 goals in 63 games, and I don't think that's sustainable. So do expect some regression there. But in general, I think Walman could be a big sleeper in your upcoming drafts. The next breakout defenseman is Adam Boqvist, who is now on the Florida Panthers. Boqvist was drafted 8th overall in the 2018 NHL entry draft, but unfortunately throughout his career, he hasn't been able to stay healthy at all, and he hasn't been the best on the defensive side of things. If you look at his career, he has not played more than 52 games in an entire season, and that is obviously concerning for some people that might be considering drafting him. But regardless, we do have to recognize that going to the Florida Panthers means that there is a ton of upside for Boqvist this upcoming year. Boqvist just signed a one-year deal in the offseason with the Panthers, and the reason why the Panthers did this is because they lost both Brandon Montour and Oliver Ekman-Larsson in free agency. Montour and Ekman-Larsson were the quarterbacks for both of the Panthers power play units last year, and now they are gone. So they have to replace those defensemen, and Boqvist is a guy that they definitely looked at as a possibility to quarterback one of these units. Now, even though I mentioned Boqvist can be a defensive liability at times, he has been superb offensively on very bad teams. In 22-23, the Blue Jackets were one of the worst teams in the NHL, and they also had the 7th worst power play percentage in the NHL. Despite this, and averaging less than 19 minutes of ice time per game, he still put up 24 points in 46 games, which is a 42-point pace. The year prior on the Blue Jackets, despite only averaging 17 minutes of ice time per game, he was on pace for 17 goals and 34 points. This was also another year where the Blue Jackets had a terrible power play, having the 9th worst power play in the NHL. The fact is, he can produce. He is good offensively, and he's good on the power play, and with OEL and Montour gone, the Panthers are absolutely going to give him an opportunity to get on this first unit. The Panthers have studs on the first unit like Alexander Barkov, Matt Tkachuk, Sam Reinhart, Reinhart, Carter Verhaeghe, and they had the 8th best power play in the NHL last season. So whoever gets on this first unit is going to gain a ton of value. You do have some competition to get on this first unit with Aaron Ekblad, who used to run the first unit a couple of seasons ago, Gustav Forsling, who has been incredible in the last couple of seasons, but they might not want to run him that many minutes per game. And then also Nate Schmidt, who could potentially be on the first unit as well. With that being said, like I've said with all these other defensemen, he's going to have to get on the first unit to truly break out. And even though we don't know what's going to happen, there is a strong case for him to get on this unit, and I'm very excited to see what happens. Boqvist is a guy that you're going to be able to draft super late, and I think he's going to be worth it as a late round flyer, depending on your league size, because obviously in like a 6-team or an 8-team league, you're probably not drafting Adam Boqvist. In conclusion, Boqvist has a ton of upside this season. I'm super excited to see what he can do, and hopefully he can stay healthy, because yes, he's made of glass, and that is a big concern. The number 2 breakout player on this list is Detroit Red Wings defenseman Erik Gustafsson. The breakout case for Gustafsson is very simple. The Red Wings were not able to sign Gostisbehere this offseason, so instead, they signed Erik Gustafsson. Gustafsson is very good offensively and on the power play, and with Gostisbehere gone, they need somebody to quarterback that first unit. I understand that many people want Seider to be on this first unit. Trust me, I want him to be on this first unit too. He puts up monster shots, hits, and blocks, and if he was on the first unit, the upside would be insane. Unfortunately, what we know about the coaching staff is they like to give Seider the toughest matchups out of any player in the NHL. They like him as a shutdown defenseman, and they don't want to run him into the ground by playing him 25 minutes a night. Am I saying that Gustafsson is guaranteed to be on this first unit? No. However, if I were to make an educated guess, I would say that there is more of a chance of Gustafsson being on this first unit over Seider. Last season when Adam Fox went down, Gustafsson was perfectly capable of running the first unit, and also Gustafsson has previous chemistry with Patrick Kane on the first line power play many years ago. Now, with all that being said, the reason why I'm excited about Erik Gustafsson more than some other defensemen on this list is because the Red Wings had the 9th best power play in the NHL last season. Gustafsson is a Shane Gostisbehere replacement, and Gostisbehere put up 56 points on this team last year, with 29 of them coming from the man advantage. I'm not saying Gustafsson is as good as Gostisbehere, I don't think that, and I don't think he's going to put up 56 points, but if he manages to stay on this first line power play for the entire season, I think 50 points is realistic. Gustafsson is not going to see a lot of even strength ice time, which does cap his ceiling a little bit, but regardless, if he gets the power play deployment that I expect him to get this year, there is a ton of upside, and he is a guy that's going to get drafted super late in your casual home leagues as well, so drafting him in the later rounds is going to benefit you quite a bit. There's only 2 negatives with Gustafsson, one being that there is a chance Seider's on this first unit. Yes, that's still a possibility. It's still in the cards. And then 2, Gustafsson does not put up a lot of peripherals, so he's not going to be that good in leagues that heavily value shots, hits, or blocks. In conclusion, I think Gustafsson is likely going to be on the first unit. I think 45 plus points is possible, and I think he's probably a sleeper in most drafts that don't heavily value shots, hits, and blocks. So yeah, I'm excited about Gustafsson, and we're just gonna have to see what happens for this upcoming year. The number 1 breakout candidate on this list is a player that has the most upside out of any defenseman in the NHL for this upcoming season. That player is Florida Panthers defenseman Gustav Forsling. Like I mentioned in the Adam Boqvist section, the players that were running the first and the second unit on the Panthers, Brandon Montour and Oliver Ekman-Larsson, are on different teams. So you have 2 players to fill the role on the power play this year, and Gustav Forsling could be the guy quarterbacking that first unit. Last season, Forsling was an absolute beast. He had 39 points in 79 games, with only 2 of those points coming from the man advantage. This is also a player that led the NHL in plus minus last year with a plus 56. Simply put, this guy is absolutely incredible, not only on the defensive end, but also the offensive end as well. The Panthers have one of the best power plays in the NHL, last season having the 8th best. They have Barkov on there, they have Reinhart, Tkachuk, Verhaeghe, absolute studs. So whoever runs his first unit is going to gain a ton of value. In my opinion, I think Forsling would be a great fit on this first line power play. I think he's extremely gifted offensively, and he probably has the best shot out of any defenseman on the Panthers as well. So having that shot on the power play is definitely beneficial. Forsling's a fantastic skater. He has a super high hockey IQ, and like I said, he has a great shot. So with all that being considered, I think he would be a fantastic fit. Unfortunately, there is a major roadblock for Forsling to get on this first unit, and that is because he is relied on heavily. He plays on the penalty kill 1, he plays very tough matchups, and he's usually the first guy that comes out after the power play is finished. I don't know if Paul Maurice wants to run Forsling 25 minutes a game, because if he's on the first unit, that's what his ice time is going to look like. Ultimately, I don't know what Paul Maurice or the coaching staff is thinking of this first unit and what they're going to do with it, but I do think there's less of a chance of Forsling getting on it versus some other guys that I've talked about before. Regardless of this, the reason why Forsling is number 1 on this list is because if he gets on the first unit, he is likely putting up 60 plus points. There's even a chance that Forsling could put up 70 plus points if he gets his power play deployment. That is a real possibility because we saw what Montour did 2 seasons ago. Forsling's also a guy that puts up really good shots, hits, and blocks, so he would be the ultimate package. He would be the perfect fantasy hockey defenseman if he got this power play time. In conclusion, Forsling is still going to be solid in fantasy without first line power play time. He's still a guy that's going to put up potentially 10 goals, 35 to 40 points, and solid peripherals, so it's not necessarily a big risk to draft him. There's a ton of upside, and I'm super excited to see who quarterbacks his first unit this year. Ultimately, value at ADP is the most important thing in fantasy, so if this hype pushes his ADP to be too pricey, I will be out. Yeah, we're just going to have to see where his ADP lies later on, closer to the season. The last 2 players I want to talk about are honorable mentions. Don't be mad at me, guys. I still think they have upside, but I do have some concerns. The first one is Jake Sanderson. I think Sanderson could be very solid in fantasy. He was solid in fantasy last year, but I do think there's a risk that Thomas Chabot is back on this first unit. So ultimately, that's a concern I have with Sanderson, and I think his ADP might be a little bit higher than I like. The second problem I have with Sanderson is that last season, he got 23 minutes and 13 seconds of ice time per game and also 3 minutes of power play time per game. So you're not going to see huge bumps in ice time. Like, there's no upside case of him gaining more deployment and then him breaking out. No, that's not there. The only upside is that the Senators bounce back from last season, which is not a guarantee. That would be the only upside, where Sanderson gets more than 14 power play points, right? If he gets like 20 to 25 and maybe the Senators improve even strength a little bit, then you could see potentially Sanderson put up 50 to 55 points, which is great, which would be great, right? That would be awesome. But I am concerned that that upside would already be baked in to his ADP. So yeah, he's definitely a breakout candidate. Don't get me wrong about it, but the upside is a little bit less than some of these other players. And what I mean by upside there is not point potential, but upside from his ADP. That is all I'm saying. There is a negative here where Chabot gets back on the first line power play and Sanderson puts up very similar points to last year. The other honorable mention I have here is Moritz Seider of the Detroit Red Wings. I talked about him a little bit when I was discussing Erik Gustafsson, and in general, I think that it's going to be Gustafsson on the first unit over Seider. That's a reason why he's not an official breakout candidate on this list. I just think that they brought in Gustafsson to replace Gostisbehere. I think that Seider is played the toughest minutes in the NHL, and I think with the same coaching staff, they're going to do the same thing. Now, what I will say, like I said in the Gustafsson section, is that there is no guarantee that Gustafsson is quarterback in his first unit. So if Seider's on there, the upside is to the moon. Seider already puts up the best hits and blocks out of any defenseman in the NHL. So if your league values those, he is an absolute stud. He's a beast in category leagues and many points leagues that value those peripherals. So you have that baked in, and then with the power play potential, you could see like 60 points with elite peripherals, which would result in him being a top 3 fantasy hockey defenseman. This obviously depends on your league settings, of course, but he has that potential if he got on the first unit. I just don't think it's going to happen, which is why he's an honorable mention. I also quickly wanted to talk about 2 players that didn't make this list. Those 2 players being Pavel Mintyukov of the Anaheim Ducks and Bowen Byram of the Buffalo Sabres. I talked about Mintyukov in my last breakout video, but ultimately my issue with him is that I don't think he has a chance to get on this first unit if Zellweger is with the team full time. And even if he is on the first unit, there's no guarantee that they run a dedicated first unit. So it's not like we're going to see huge bumps in his deployment. The Ducks are probably not going to have a top 20 power play this year, and there is a chance that Mintyukov is behind both Zellweger and Fowler in power play time per game. I think Mintyukov has the potential to be a superstar in the future, but ultimately for the season, I'm not sure if his ceiling is that high. Now with Bowen Byram, the main issue is that Rasmus Dahlin is a lock to run this first line power play, and it would have to take a Dahlin injury for Byram to actually break out. They're not going to run 2 defensemen on the first unit, guys. It just doesn't work. I know they did it last year, but the only reason why they did it last year is because they were just trying to throw stuff at the wall to see what worked. Ultimately, you could see Byram put up 30 to 40 points, even if he's not running the first unit, but based off his production last year, that's not really a huge breakout. In conclusion, Byram's going to be solid in fantasy, but because Dahlin's a lock to be on this first unit, that is why Byram did not make this list. All right, guys, that's the end of the video. Hit that like button. It helps support the channel. Hit that subscribe button if you're new. Follow my X/Twitter at FIREDUP Fantasy. I post up-to-date information on there. Join the Discord community. The link is in the description. And last but not least, have a good one. I'll catch you in the next one.